In my time writing game reviews, one thing has made itself very clear. Indie games deserve more love. I can't count on two hands the number of times I've seen someone on Twitter, not calling it X, sorry, complain about the lack of games out there when 100 indie games released today alone. And in a world where some of the leading gaming personalities believe Dave the Diver is an indie game, the truth is that everyone should be playing more indies. It's in that sentiment that this series was born. Hello and welcome to Indie Impact, where I'll be highlighting a couple of indie titles that can be found for free, or for cheap, somewhere on the internet, discussing their pros, their cons, and letting you know if they're impacts or setbacks. So, without further ado, here are today's selections. I have played a ton of indies in my time, and every so often one reminds me why I adore this medium. FutureGrind, developed and published by Milkbag Games, was one that I redeemed years ago with the ultimate intention of taking for a whirl, but for some reason or another, I was unable to until recently. But when I say FutureGrind had me in a vice grip with its simplistic yet complex blend of side-scrolling rail-based gameplay and artistic infusion of starkly relevant themes, you should definitely believe me. It's a fast-paced cross between the quick restart gameplay style you might normally find in a mobile game without the ads and intentional slowdowns that make playing those mobile games an absolute chore. At its core, FutureGrind's levels come with a very simple objective: make it to the level's end in one piece. But an added layer of complication is found when certain levels are capped by bonus challenges that reveal hints about the game's overarching story. I don't believe a game like this necessarily needs a story, but the fact that it exists and that it's more relevant now than when it was released is interesting. Let's take a look at FutureGrind's pros. I think the combination of FutureGrind's visuals alongside its electronic soundtrack is a winning one, to be sure. I found myself hypnotized by the musical backdrop of absolute bangers. I know that some might consider this to be one of the game's cons, but I adore the quick restart style that FutureGrind adopted. It allows you to, theoretically anyway, play at your own leisure. It also created situations where I'd start playing at 7 p.m. but wouldn't stop until hours later, so take from that what you will. It reminded me very much of Raised in that regard. Let's take a look at FutureGrind's cons. I know I just complimented the musical backdrop, but the audio balance could use some work. I had to frequently adjust my headphone levels to prevent the music from bursting my eardrums. I feel there's an unfair difficulty spike towards the game's finale that might cause some players to abandon all hope and move on to something less frustrating. Some might call that a skill issue, but I have a little something called empathy, and I can understand how frustrating that can be. I believe the final levels are fun and challenging, but they are also a bit unfair to average players. It might be obvious by this point, but I am most certainly going to say that FutureGrind is an impact. I had a really good time with it, and if you like what you've seen and heard so far, I think you will as well. You can pick up FutureGrind for $13.49 on the PlayStation Store for PS4 and $19.99 for both Nintendo Switch and PC via Steam and the Epic Games Store. It's a bit pricey, but I think it's worth its weight. It's about damn time I mention this game in this series. I am firm in my belief that we're experiencing a rhythm game revolution. Between Friday Night Funkin', Bits and Bops, and Melatonin, fans of titles like Dance Dance Revolution and Rhythm Heaven are eating good. But what about Parappa the Rapper? In Scratchin Melodii, developed and published by LJ Leffenstar, we're given a return to classic rhythm-based gameplay the likes of which we haven't seen in any real capacity since Parappa the Rapper in 1996 and Jammer Lammy in 1999. In the game, which is in development but has a pretty extensive demo available for free, we play as Melodii, who has to repay their debt to society when they're caught spray painting local buildings. As in its clear inspiration, Melodii's town is populated by a cavalcade of interesting characters, but get this, with one exception, the voices are provided by an assortment of vocal synthesizers, including Vocaloid. Its music, composed almost entirely of electronic and hip-hop stylings, is absolutely brilliant. I've woken up with one song in particular from the game's soundtrack in my head, and it simply wouldn't go away until I pulled it up on YouTube. To add, while the game's a spiritual successor to the now vacant throne once occupied by Parappa, Scratchin Melodii adds a unique spin on the traditional gameplay with its scratching system. In addition to hitting the letter keys on a keyboard or face buttons on a controller, sometimes you'll need to press a corresponding arrow key or directional button in time with the music, which can be tricky as all hell. Let's look at Scratchin Melodii's pros. It's practically oozing style. From the 2D overworld to the rhythm battles to the fact that almost all the voices are provided by vocal synths, this game appeals to my very specific aesthetic, and I love almost everything about it. It's filled to the brim with references to other games, with one level being set in a fast food restaurant, which I believe to be a clever callback to Parappa the Rapper 2, and one level which is conceptualized around a Puyo Puyo-like backdrop, which also has a reference to Parappa. Let's look at Scratchin Melodii's cons. It's painstakingly difficult. In the most recent demo, the game claims to be designed more for a controller than a keyboard, but in my experience, neither method is preferable to the other. I would sometimes fail levels tens of times because the scratching segment was very difficult. I feel this could change as the game's developed, but the vocal synthesizers are sometimes very difficult to understand. It's great that subtitles are there to counteract this, but I would love to see the voices become clearer as development continues. As I mentioned, Scratchin Melodii is currently in development, but you can try out its most recent demo, which contains a whopping 6 levels and a small dose of story that will be continued in the full game. I am definitely gonna call this one an impact, with the understanding that I'll have to revisit it in another episode of Indie Impact, or perhaps its own video when it formally launches. The most recent demo for Scratchin Melodii is currently available exclusively on PC via LJ Leffenstar's official website.